8th graders. This is History, Chapter 19, Section 3, The United States at War. This is Part 1. I will be starting on page 589. After the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the U.S. entered World War II and helped the Allies win. With little warning, Japanese bombers attacked the American fleet based at Pearl Harbor. Shortly after noon, on Sunday, December 7, 1941, President Roosevelt had just finished lunch when he received an urgent telephone call from Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary had just received a wire from Hawaii. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. In 2 hours, Japanese planes sank many vessels, including 5 battleships and 3 destroyers, and heavily damaged many others. The attack also destroyed about 250 airplanes, and about 4,500 people were killed or wounded. Only the fleet's aircraft carriers, out of the harbor on maneuvers, escaped the devastation. If you ever get the chance to visit Hawaii, you want to visit the USS Arizona Memorial. It is a beautiful, somber memorial of this date, December 7th, 1941. The world at war. However determined the American people were to defeat the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, the immediate outlook was bleak. Japanese victories in the Pacific. The destruction of the American fleet removed Japan's only obstacle in the Pacific. For 6 months, the Japanese won victory after victory, capturing American bases at Guam and Wake Island, conquering Britain's colonies in Hong Kong and Singapore, and occupying the independent kingdom of Thailand. In April of 1942, American forces on the peninsula of Bataan in the Philippines finally surrendered. Meanwhile, Japanese forces conquered Burma and the East Indies. German success in Europe. Axis forces occupied nearly all of Europe, and Britain was besieged. In North Africa, German General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, led an Italian-German force toward the Suez Canal, pushing the British back to the borders of Egypt. By summer of 1942, the Germans had pushed deep into the Soviet Union, capturing the rich farmland of the Ukraine and threatening the cities of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow. Success or failure of the war in Europe depended on whether the Soviet Union could hold out until the United States and Britain could launch an offensive on the Western Front. Even before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American strategists had decided that in the event of war, United States forces would concentrate on defeating Hitler before dealing with Japan. Not only did the United States have closer ties with the countries occupied by Germany, but Germany seemed a greater threat to the Western Hemisphere, where Nazi sympathies were strong in several Latin American nations. Churchill agreed with this plan, observing that the defeat of Germany will leave Japan exposed to an overwhelming force, whereas the defeat of Japan would by no means bring the World War to an end. The key is to defeat Germany first. The turning point of the war. Meanwhile, German troops launched a second attack on the Soviets in 1942. In the spring, they moved toward the oil fields near the Caspian Sea, and by midsummer, they were more than halfway to their goal. I want to pause for just a moment. There is a very good map on the top of this page, page 591, and it shows the Axis powers in dark green. It shows the Axis control in light green. Their influence had spread. They had attacked or now occupy everything in green. Now the Allies, that's the side we are on, the United States, That's kind of the pinkish color. So you can see the influence of the Axis powers is far-reaching here in Europe. Stalin pleaded with the Allied leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, for an invasion of Western Europe that would take some pressure off the Soviet Union. Churchill told him that such a second front in Europe was a year away. Soviet troops were left to face the Germans alone. In September of 1942, the Red Army, that's the Soviet Army, made a desperate and heroic stand at Stalingrad. For 4 months, Soviet and German troops battled house to house for control of the city. Although the German invasion was halted, Stalingrad was reduced to rubble, and the Soviets suffered more casualties defending it than the United States did the entire war. Stalin never forgave Roosevelt and Churchill for allowing this to happen. In November, the Soviet Army counterattacked. Taking advantage of the Russian winter, the Red Army surrounded Hitler's freezing forces. In February of 1943, the tattered remains of the invading German army, only 1/3 of its 330,000 men still alive, surrendered. German weak point exposed. In North Africa, American and British forces, working first separately and then together, pushed Rommel and his Africa Corps into Tunisia, under the command first of Major General Lloyd R. Friedenthal, and then of Major General George S. Patton. American forces checked Rommel's drive at Kasserine Pass and took El Guitar and Bizret. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing some of these correctly. Under General Bernard L. Montgomery, the British took Tripoli and Tunis. By May, Rommel had fled. Nearly 250,000 Axis troops had surrendered, and the campaign in North Africa was over. In August of 1943, British and American forces took Sicily, and in September, they invaded the Italian mainland. After his defeat in Sicily, Mussolini was overthrown, and the new Italian government quickly surrendered. German troops still occupied Italy, however, and put up fierce resistance in the mountainous terrain. Not until June of 1944 did the Allies enter Rome. Victory in Europe. Allied air forces had already begun round-the-clock bombing of German industrial and transportation centers, but Hitler's armies had to be defeated on the ground. Normandy invasion. On June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious force in history, 176,000 troops, carried in 5,000 vessels, crossed the English Channel to land along a 60-mile stretch of coastline in France. This invasion at Normandy was known as D-Day. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1 million Allied forces were in France within a month after D-Day. On July 25th, the Americans broke through the German line. By early August, General George S. Patton and his forces were raging across northern France through open countryside. In August, American and British troops broke out of Normandy and struck rapidly eastward, entering Paris on August 25th, 1944. In September, they crossed the western border into Germany. I do encourage you, if you are interested, to read more about D-Day and what happened at Normandy. There's so much more to the story here than what this mere paragraph says. That was a key point in this war. Rapid Soviet advance from the east. At the same time, the Soviets closed in from the east. In January of 1944, the Red Army freed Leningrad from an 890-day German siege. The Germans were in control of that city for 890 days. That's like over 2 years. By spring, Soviet troops had freed Ukraine, and in July, they entered Poland. In August, Romania and Bulgaria surrendered, opening the Balkans to the Soviets. In December, they entered Hungary, and by the end of 1944, most of Eastern Europe was in Soviet hands. Germany surrenders. In December of 1944, Hitler ordered a counterattack of Belgium. Although Allied lines bulged, the Germans could not break through. The Battle of the Bulge was the last German offensive. In March of 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine River and moved into the heart of Germany. Meanwhile, the Soviets pushed from the east, taking Berlin in April of 1945. In April, Hitler committed suicide in his underground shelter in Berlin, and on May 7, 1945, German leaders agreed to an unconditional surrender. Franklin D. Roosevelt, who led the nation through the Depression and the war, however, did not witness the event. Only days before Hitler's suicide, the president died of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Crimes against humanity. As they entered Germany, Allied armies discovered evidence of one of the most terrible acts of the war, the Nazi Holocaust, or deliberate extermination of millions of European Jews and other civilians. As early as 1942, the US government had received reports that Hitler had ordered the murder of all Jews in Germany, in German-occupied territories. Only in 1944 did Roosevelt respond to criticism within his own administration that the US was passively accepting the murder of Jews. He created a war refugee board, but for 6 out of 10 Jews in Europe, this action came too late. Not until Allied troops reached the Nazi death camps at Auschwitz, Dachau, Buchenwald, and elsewhere, and found the survivors and the gas chambers in which so many had died, was the horrible truth fully revealed. The Nazis had killed 12 million people, of whom 6 million were Jews. This is one of the atrocities of this war. The men and women who were put into these work camps, concentration camps, relocation camps. Auschwitz is one of the famous ones. They were worked, some tortured, starved, and then eventually gassed, killed. The Nazis did this. It actually happened. And it's one of the very sad, sad parts of this very sad war. Thanks for listening.